I'm really delighted to be here. I gather we're on broadcasting because my neighbor, who has a 9-month-old child, wanted to come, but she decided she'd watch it at home. So she tells me she's connected. So we have at least one viewer. As you probably heard, because the opera did a very big promotional effort these past many months, this is the 100th anniversary of the San Francisco Opera. But what they didn't particularly want you to know is it's the 90th anniversary of the opening of the War Memorial Buildings, the Opera House and the Veterans Building. And the first performance of the opera in the new Opera House was on October 15th, 1932. And so this story of how these buildings got to the point where they were finished is one of your typical San Francisco stories. It lasted 20 years. It was very convoluted. There were controversies. There were upsets. There were all sorts of problems, just like we do every time. So when I start, I want to give you a bit of background. At the end of the 18th, 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, as some of you may know, the United States had a progressive movement. And that movement involved all sorts of things, from dealing with corruption to bringing good management to local and state government, to eliminating unsanitary conditions, all the way down to getting rid of billboards. And part of it was sort of a related movement called the City Beautiful movement, which lasted in its heyday about 10 years, from 1900 to 1910 or 15, although in San Francisco you could claim it went all the way into up to the Second World War. And that movement was interested in building parkways, building trees and so forth. And then there was a second part which focused on civic center. So first slide I want you to see is from the Columbian exhibition in Chicago of 1893. This is the so-called Court of Honor. About 40% of the population of San Francisco, of the United States, visited the fair, and they found a planned community with all these beautiful neoclassical-like buildings, and it was just overwhelming and made a huge impression on virtually everybody from the top to the bottom of society. And then there was a panic and a depression, so things didn't really get organized in terms of programs and policies till the beginning of the 20th century. And but the City Beautiful movement became quite a important topic among city planners and businessmen and so forth. And as I mentioned, part of that was this notion about building civic centers. And there we go. A man named Charles Moultrie Robinson, who was a journalist who had gone to Chicago and was quite impressed, started writing articles, first in Harper's and then books, on how to reconfigure and improve the city. And his second book was entitled Modern Civic Art, or The City Made Beautiful. And in it, there's 2 or 3 chapters about creating a civic center. What he had in mind is every city should have certain focal points and particularly a heart of the city where the public buildings would be, or city government, perhaps state government, but also places of learning and culture And these would be magnificent buildings surrounding a big plaza, so that you could stand in the plaza and see the architecture. If you built, he felt that if you built them on each side of a street, you would never be able to see the buildings. And these would be places where everyone could come and experience sort of a palatial setting to make them feel more part of the community, that this was a part of their city, and you know, they were welcome to come to the People's City Hall or the People's Concert Hall and so forth. And all these notions were brought to San Francisco by James Phelan, who was the mayor until the end of 1901. But after he left office, he brought Daniel Burnham of Chicago to San Francisco, who prepared a master plan for the city, which you all may have heard of. That plan was very grandiose. It sort of, you could probably say, wanted to create San Francisco as Athens or Rome. But it also helped people to understand what all this City Beautiful stuff was about. The earthquake of 1906 kind of put the kibosh on doing anything about the plan. Here is the City Hall. After the earthquake and fire, the steel structure held up, but all the stone work around it sort of fell over, and it became unusable. Burnham arrived back from, he was on a trip from Europe. He came back to San Francisco as soon as he could, feeling that he could help rebuild the city. The people weren't interested in hearing about his plan, and he said, "Oh, no, I don't want to make you think about all these grandiose things. We just need to get the streets working better and so forth." But the private enterprise just sort of proceeded. Also, later that year in 1906, the district attorney indicted the mayor, 17 of the 18 supervisors, and the police chief for graft and corruption. And by July of 1907, he had them in trial, or they had admitted to guilt. And so the city government was wiped out. And the district attorney and his colleagues went out and recruited a whole new city government. So needless to say, there was no strong force on the public sector. The people that he chose, particularly Mayor Robertson. My mind is getting blank. Who was the dean of Hastings Law School? Were great men of great stature, but not politicians. They had to rebuild, reestablish city government, and then try to rebuild things. The new government, and then the successive one. In those days, the mayor was only elected for two-year terms. Really couldn't get it together to deal with the public buildings, particularly City Hall. And so from 1906 until the early part of 1911, things just sort of stood the way they were. The old City Hall was actually torn down in 1909, but there wasn't any concrete plan to replace it. Now, what happened was that the business community, I need to watch the time here, the business community got organized, and I think I'm talking too much, and got Congress to award San Francisco a world exposition to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. And the business people who got it that far and created the Panama exhibition company, then decided that they needed to have a strong new mayor because the mayor at that time, P.H. McCarthy, was from the building trades, and he was not the kind of guy that they thought we needed to do things. So in the election in 1911, they put forth one of their people, James Rolph, who lived in the Mission, was involved in shipping, had great relations with the shipping unions, certainly well regarded by the banking community, and he turned out to be the perfect politician. So here he is out campaigning. You can see he's really good at glad handing and so forth. So he was elected in the primary by such a large amount that there really wasn't a second election in November, and he had three basic platforms, planks in his platform. The building of a new city hall and civic center. He used that term all along because he picked it up and he felt that San Francisco needed something like that. And then finishing out the transportation system and also building a public water system. But his first goal, because the fair was going to open in 1915, was to get the city's house in order. Because as he told people, if you're inviting guests, then you have to have a decent house to entertain them in. You can't just entertain them in a empty lot. So he was busily, even before he was inaugurated, in getting Civic Center organized and getting a constituency behind it, and recruited the most prominent architect on the West Coast, John Galen Howard, who at that point in time was professor of architecture at Berkeley and the consulting architect for the University of California. He had a long career of having studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had worked for McKin, Mead and White in New York, the famous firm that did all the big mansions and other things for New York wealthy people. And so he asked Howard and two others to take this notion of a civic center and develop it into a plan. There we go. And so he developed this plan, which, if you can fully understand it, shall we say the bottom is Market Street, at the top is Van Ness, and he proposed shifting the city hall from where it used to be on Larkin to Van Ness, and then the plaza in the middle, and having two major structures on the Larkin end of the plaza. And Mayor Rolph and the Board of Supervisors agreed with this plan and put on the ballot for March 28th in 1912, an $8.8 million bond issue to pay for the building of a city hall and the acquisition of enough land surrounding the area to accommodate other public buildings. And one of Rolph's selling point was that this just wouldn't be empty space. He already had lined up other buildings to be in the area. He got the exhibition people, the exhibition company, to pay for an auditorium, which is what we now call the Bill Graham Auditorium. It was originally the exhibition auditorium. And he got the state to put a building where the state building is. He proposed putting the library where the Asian Art Museum, and he proposed putting an opera house where the new main library is. His partners in that effort was a group of very wealthy businessmen, William Crocker, William Bourne from the Spring Valley Water Company, Isaiah Hellman from the Wells Fargo Bank, who were part of a group that they called the Music Association of San Francisco. They were people who wanted a symphony in San Francisco and had begun effort as early as 1909 to do that. And they wanted what they called an opera house, not because they were fans of opera necessarily, but they wanted a concert hall. And they agreed to put up $1 million for this building. So the matter was put to the voters. 92% of the voters approved. And part of that was that was the first election that women were allowed to vote in California. And a lot of the women leaders who had been in favor of suffrage wanted to show that women were going to be active. So they, they went out and solicited them to vote. 92% passed this bond issue, which was a great achievement for Rolph, and it also showed that the notions of City Beautiful and Civic Center were well accepted by the general population. So Howard's plan was fully adopted by July 1st, and attention was now given to the Opera House. The Music Association leaders asked a famous architect, Willis Polk, a local architect, to design a scheme for an opera house on that site, and he came up with this. It looks a little bit like the Palais Garnier in Paris, but it certainly gave a strong impression that this was a very important building. The Music Society people, as I said, agreed to raise $1 million. And in their minds, people who gave money would get things in return, which would be, if you gave a substantial sum, you would get the right to a particular box or a set of seats in the new auditorium. And they felt that those rights should be passed on to heirs. So it was like hereditary. They also felt that the building should be controlled by a majority of the directors who were from their organization. That proposal was shown to the mayor and the board of supervisors, and on February 3rd, 1913, it was approved. Now, lawyers always get into the works, and they said, we're a little uneasy. This is both the lawyers for the Music Association for the city. We're a little uneasy about all this. We should have a confirmation lawsuit. So they went to the courts and asked if this was okay. And much to people's chagrin, the court said, no, it violates the city charter. So back to the drawing boards, and in the summer, they had rearranged it so that the mayor would appoint 10 of the directors, and the other 6 would be people from various from city officials. And that was passed by the board in November. Now, since Mayor Rolph had been involved in this for these more than 2 years, and since he was a close associate of these business people, and he had indicated a strong support for an opera house, he announced, to the shock of everyone, on November 20th, that he was going to veto the proposal. Now, people were particularly perplexed. The city attorney said, well, he didn't talk to us about it. We're not part of the decision. Several of the supervisors who were big proponents of this said, we have no idea what's going on. And it gets a little murky. The newspapers reported that the mayor and some of his close political associates had gone to Fresno for a meeting of the progressive Republicans. If you recall, in California and in many places in the United States, there was a progressive wing of the Republican Party. And they had succeeded in getting Hiram Johnson elected governor. And the Chronicle reported that there was some sort of a deal whereby Johnson would run for the Senate and Rolph would run for governor. Now, he'd only been in office two years, but that he couldn't succeed as a progressive Republican by supporting a Opera House proposal where the donors received inheritable rights to boxes and seats. Now, the mayor said that he was doing it on good government basis, that he was opposed to the inheritance of the boxes, and that the Opera House should be a public opera house. And in fact, this was the first proposal to build a municipally owned, or at least involved with, opera house in the United States. But the veto basically put the kibosh on everything. The World's Fair opened in February of 1915. So he vetoed it in 1914, or in 1913. Then they were busy getting the fair together. It opened in 1915, and there was some talk after the fair closed about starting over again, but then World War I was declared, and of course building materials and other things were unavailable, and so it's nothing they could do to resurrect the idea until after the war was nearly over. That meant that particular block remained vacant, and then of course it remained vacant for the next 80 years until the new main library was put there. William Crocker from the Crocker Bank decided that he and some of his associates would start all over again, and they decided that they would build an opera house without the city on a piece of property that wasn't the city's. They had their eye on a parcel that is where Davies Hall is now, which was then the campus of St. Ignatius College, which was destroyed by the earthquake and fire and was just a vacant lot. And so they decided that this new project needed to get the Regents of the University of California involved as the fiduciary who would take the money. Again, we're going to raise $1.5 million or so. And they asked Willis Polk, here's a picture of him, to do a new scheme. Oops. Here is a rendering done in 1913 by an artist named Jules Guérin for Howard of his plan, and you can see the Opera House as formally proposed on the site, the library, City Hall, etc. And here is Willis Polk's new plan for the new site. And they needed additional money, and there was talk about making this into a war memorial. And they then became acquainted with a man named Charles Kendrick, who was a realtor, an investor, and in age 41 or 42, he had volunteered to go to war and became a major in the Army. And when the war was over, he was one of the founders of the American Legion. And they consulted with him about making it a war memorial and raising money as a veterans project. And he was very enthusiastic. He thought Opera House would be a terrific idea. And so he went out and consulted various other people in the veterans movement. And they came back and he said that the Willis Pope design had to be sort of reworked so that the auditorium is in the back, which would be on Franklin Street, and then one of the wings would be for the veterans, and the other wing would be for the Art Institute. And I neglected to mention the Art Institute in all of this, but oops, there is Mr. Kendrick, and he will find that he plays a big role in all of this through the next period of time. The Art Institute inherited the home of Mark Hopkins on Nob Hill, which burned down. And so they agreed that they would sell the property and contribute the money to the Opera House project, which could be also now described as an Academy of Art. And they actually put up the money to purchase the St. Ignatius property. That's where the money came from. And they would then get a chunk of the new building which became the Museum of Modern Art. So that's another ingredient that we need to add to the story. And, oops, anyway. So Kendrick decides to raise money from the public and has, can we go, how do I go back again? They decide that they will have that they will devote the week before, no, one more. That's the one that does it? Oops, sorry. There we go. That they would devote the week before Memorial Day in 1920 to a week of fundraising to add money to the war memorial. And in typical fashion, this involved a parade. It involved various ceremonies, concerts, and even involved an all-night dance event at Dreamland, which was a big public hall that some of you may remember because the ice volleys used to play there until it got torn down. And in the course of that, they raised quite a lot of money, so that now they had about over 2 million. And they then went back to the regents of the university, who agreed to take it and look after it. But the regents' attorneys, unfortunately, attorneys can be very picky, decided that the pledge documents that people had signed willing to give money were not suitable. So they had to go back to 65,000 donors and, get new pledges or get the cash. It took 2 years. And so they weren't finished until in the fall of 1922. So now they got the money or the pledges in the bank. They had ready to create an architectural committee to advise them. And that architectural committee was chaired by Bernard Maybeck, famous architect of the Palace of Fine Arts, who was on the faculty at the University of California and the architecture school, and included the 3 architects who worked on Civic Center, Arthur Brown, the architect of City Hall, and 2 or 3 others. And they, within a month, came and said, whoops, all the things you want to put in this nice little building won't fit. We need more property. And they recommended that the 2 adjoining blocks, which faced City Hall, the city condemned them and purchased them across from City Hall. This is a photograph from, I don't know, 1923, 24. The lighter colored lot above City Hall is the St. Ignatius property where they were going to put the building. And then the 2 adjoining parcels are the ones they wanted to condemn, and they, as you can see, there are little buildings on it. So not only did they have to condemn the property, but they had to buy these private property owners out. And the proponents of the War Memorial said, we'll pay for it, the city doesn't have to pay for it. So back to the drawing boards, and the architecture committee, but particularly Arthur Brown and Willis Polk, began to prepare a new set of drawings for the 2 buildings. And they used in their minds the model from the Place de Vendôme in Paris of 2 identical buildings side by side. You can find those also in Philadelphia and in Cleveland, but these would be ours. And one would be for the Opera House, the other would be for the Veterans Building, but it would also include the Art Institute. And so the 2 building proposal is ready to show by 1923, and there it is. That is a very grand version of it that was actually prepared in 1927, but you can see there, these are looking through the court toward City Hall. You can see all the columns on either side of the building. You have a memorial, what's the word I want, pole in the middle, and this is going to be a big deal. Well, that proposal, was worked on by the architects. Willis Polk actually died in September of 1924, and so it was basically in Arthur Brown's hands, although he had the assistance of a specialist in auditorium architecture, Alfred. Oops, I have a mental block. Anyway, so Polk is working away, and during this time, opera becomes a fascination by a lot of people in San Francisco. They do it on the cheap, both at Stanford and the Frost Auditorium. They do it in the Civic Auditorium, and then in 1923 they create the San Francisco Opera Association, and so that brings Gaetano Merola into the picture, and all of opera lovers who are going to be supporters of an opera house, a symphony hall, and so forth. Alfred Landsberg is the other architect. He was also at the École Beaux-Arts, but he had a specialist in doing auditoriums. And so Brown is given the task of trying to match design with costs. And this is becoming more and more difficult. And this particular scheme is going to be very expensive. Now, that did not deter the proponents from having a groundbreaking, which they did in 1926. They did it on Memorial Day, and again, they had a parade, a concert, all sorts of to-do, and this was the groundbreaking for both the Opera House and the Veterans Building. And but the veterans are now getting particularly uneasy about all of this. They're beginning to feel that more energy is going to the Opera House than in their needs, and the original American Legion people and others who had proposed a War Memorial Opera House were officers who, like Kendrick, who became businessmen and professional people, and they remained active in Veterans Affairs, but they were on a different cultural basis from the infantry people, the more ordinary soldiers. And the veterans organizations for many of those types of people were thinking of what you call maybe a classic American Legion Hall with a bar and a pool room and a swimming pool and things like that. And they were wondering why they weren't going to get that, because in the Veterans Building as proposed by Polk, they were going to get offices and maybe some meeting rooms and not much more. Well, they hadn't reached the point where they were really furious, but Polk, Arthur Brown went to his committee, his board, and also they showed it to the Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and Brown said we need at least $4 million more to get anywhere close to that. And this is in the 20s. Things are still pretty, people are still pretty affluent and moving forward. And so they agreed that we're going to have a bond issue, and the bond issues put on the ballot, and it passes by quite a large margin in June of 1927. Now, the city attorney had used legislation to underpin the bond issue, which wasn't the legislation that says you can borrow money for any public purpose, but a particular section of legislation which authorized the borrowing and selling of bonds to building veterans related buildings for their use and any auxiliary purposes. Now that presented a bit of a problem when in the final push so the bond issue passed. Now there's enough money, although Brown has to eliminate another $1 million of cost to get down to that level. And he's again talking to the veterans who feel, again, that they're not getting the fair shake that, in their minds, the facade of the building, which looks just like the other one, does not give them the dignity that they need. They have various complaints about the architecture, and again, they bring up all their unhappiness about the fact that the building doesn't have things about them. And then they're also upset that the Art Institute has a dominant role in what is their building. The Art Institute, which has become the Museum of Art, would enter through the front door. It would have several floors of galleries, and etc. So they start really putting the pressure on, and what they want is, okay, if the Art Institute is going to, we want an auditorium too. We want a place where we can all get together and have a meeting or a performance or whatever. And so Brown and Landsberg created an auditorium in the Veterans Building, which in the original design had a floor that went up and down, so it could also be a dance floor, a ballroom. And then they sort of banished the Art Institute to the 4th floor, and they said that it should have an entrance on McAllister Street, not on Van Ness Street, and they can come in there and take an elevator and go about their business without interfering with us. Well, as I said, the legislation gave the veterans a lot more power. So those kind of changes were begun to be adapted in that building. Now, at the same time, the people realized that they had various pots of money. They had the money that the regents had, they had the bond money, but there was no city agency to take everything and put it together and organize the building. So Mr. Kendrick went to the mayor and said, we need a charter amendment to create an appropriate war memorial agency. And he proposed legislation where the mayor would appoint 10. Well, the mayor would appoint all of the members. Now, the veterans by this time had lost all trust in Kendrick and, to a large measure, the mayor, and they objected. And the charter amendment to create the war memorial only passed by 717 votes because the veterans weren't fully behind it. So this gets us to 1928, early 1929, and the mayor makes appointments. The veterans had demanded that veterans be put on the War Memorial Board, and the mayor, it takes him until August 1929 to release the list of his trustees, of which 5 are veterans, but they're kind of, there's a general, there's the head of the state American Legion, 2 supervisors that had been fought in the wars, and Charles Kendrick, plus representatives of the symphony and the opera, the publisher of the Examiner, the head of Standard Oil, those kind of people. This was right before the election in 1929. The veterans went to the Board of Supervisors and spent several hours giving their grievances. The board turned down the mayor's recommendations by a vote of 13-4, and that sort of stopped everything for a while. He then, in 1930, comes back in February with a new list, and he's added another veteran, although this veteran is a banker, a very prominent social person, and but Kendrick is still there, and the veterans again complain bitterly, but the Board of Supervisors is tired of all this, and they unanimously approved the new Veterans War Memorial Board and the 6 veterans and 9 others. And the veterans, just had to resign to this because there was no way they could stop it. So now you have a board, you have an agency, and you have the money, and it's time to get underway. The project is underway, and because people need work, and the cost of materials are down, they were able to do a great deal more than they had originally planned, although they had to accommodate the amount of money they had to squeeze the two buildings by 10 feet, make them narrower, partly reflected the recommendations of some acoustical people who said a 4,000-seat auditorium was kind of unwieldy. You should have a 3,000-seat auditorium. They eliminated the stone from the upper levels of the building. They installed terracotta, and they got rid of all the columns on the inner court, as you may remember by going over there. So of the money that was available, they were able to do virtually everything, but they couldn't afford an organ in the symphony hall. Everything else came through, and as all of you have been in these buildings, they are beautiful, magnificent buildings, all of which were accomplished by $6 million and the talent of primarily Arthur Brown. So here is a picture of the Opera House under construction, and they had a dedication of the two buildings in September of 1932, and then we had the opening of the opera. This is Tosca on October 15th, 1932. Remember this, Roosevelt has just become president. These are really dark times, but this was a gala event. Everybody got all of their fancy dress out of mothballs, and whatever money they had, they bought tickets, and it was like the highlight of the year. And that began the season. That began the opera in the War Memorial Opera House. Now, the Art Museum, it took until 1935 to get its installation on the fourth floor of the Veterans Building, and the Memorial Court landscaping by Thomas Church, that also didn't occur until 1935. So that is the story. It took 20 years, but it basically, they expanded Civic Center from the original design to the other side of Van Ness Avenue. They used this French Baroque, neo-Baroque architecture, which is given, so there's this relationship with City Hall and the Veterans Building. I mean, these are the most magnificent public buildings and complex of them in the United States. And, you know, with the dome on City Hall, some people think it's a state capitol instead of the City Hall. But that's the story. 20 years. It was a lot of effort and agony. And to be honest with you, the veterans have never been fully satisfied and periodically erupt and demand that, you know, they're not being treated well. Particularly since, you know, the Art Museum and other cultural affairs keep sort of accreting into what their world is. But of course, many of the veterans organizations haven't been using their offices very much and so forth. But that tension is still there. It's a bit of a class tension, and it probably may never go away. But that's the story. And I've skipped over a whole lot of stuff. It's all in my book. And there's also a whole other chapter in there about Davies Hall, which is an equally convoluted and controversial story of how that was built. There was a contest whether it should be built where it ended up being built, or it should be built in the vacant lot where the original Opera House was going to be. And you can read all about all that nonsense in the book. And the Historical Society has a whole case of them, and you can buy it from the Historical Society, and I don't get any of the money.
Thank you, Tim. I do want to make one mention of its most sensational use, which would be in 1945.
That is true, and that is in my book. The Secretary of State Stettinius, who was at Yalta, called up the mayor at the time, The businessman mayor.
Was Lapham? No.
Lapham called up Mayor Lapham and said, the president has just announced that the UN will be founded in San Francisco in 6 months. Can you get it together? And needless to say, we did. And they had these magnificent buildings in order to where they could accommodate all that. So I don't know if Roosevelt was aware of that and he had it in mind, but anyway, it came down, and in the book it talks about how they were supposed to come for a couple of weeks. They stayed 6 months. It's quite a deal. And I must complain, there is not a good exhibit about the UN anywhere in San Francisco, including the Veterans Building. There's just one painting with not much of a way of a label.
There was even talk, because we were war with Japan and so forth, so on, that the whole thing would move to the Pacific, was that maybe the United Nations would be someplace in the Bay Area. There was a whole bunch of plans like that, and we know very well.
I'm dealing with 45 now.
Go ahead, Gary.
Push for the UN, and a lot of people rallied for it to be put in San Francisco. But unfortunately, they stuck it in New York. But it was very much wanted to be in San Francisco.
But Nelson Rockefeller opened up his bank account and said, we'll buy the site and do this and that. And
that has that people don't realize that the actual founding of the UN was in that building in 1945. Right. But they wanted to have a headquarters, which is in New York.
They talked about a parcel in Marin County. They talked about a couple of different parcels, but it never happened, obviously.
well, they're probably local people with brainstorming. But the powers that be.
It was the governor, everybody in California. Yeah. They had everybody involved, and the newspapers, the building industry, all that. Everybody wanted it, but unfortunately.
Well, Nelson Rockefeller overrode them all.
Not the movers and shakers.
We have a few minutes for questions.
I ran across this brief newspaper article from 1929, just 3 paragraphs, and it's horrific simplification of you touched on probable funding and sources of income and that. This is, like I said, it's 3 paragraphs. I'll read it quickly. Parking problem solved by, quote, mayor. A solution of San Francisco's War Memorial and parking problem was presented to the Board's Public Works at a meeting yesterday by Michael Hirschbaum, self-styled mayor of Hayes Valley. Hirschbaum would slice a strip off the Fulton Street side of Golden Gate Park, Canyon Street, Beach, and sell the land for residence lots. With $50 million from the sale, he would erect a 30-story building on a proposed War Memorial site for parking autos. The income would cut the tax rate drastically, the mayor told the board. Hirschbaum was told to present the scheme to the supervisors. This is the only reference.
And he got to the mayor? He got the mayor, Rolph?
No, he was the self-styled mayor. Quote, mayor, unquote. So this is a neighborhood advocate proponent for, I guess, whatever was beneficial for Hayes Valley. You know more about what was happening in 1929, the funding and that than I ever would. I thought this was just an incredible piece of.
Yeah, the money had been put together, and in 1929 you had this tension between the mayor and the veterans, and he was trying to take care of it, and things weren't moving very quickly. So maybe Hirschfeld sort of thought he'd go in, and I think it's a bit of a little blip that had no effect on anything.
Right.
And where did you find that?
It's kind of a convoluted series of events that was in the Chronicle, September 7th, 1929.
All right.
Okay?
All right.
Thanks to our viewers.
Right.
My neighbor.
Lana's over here, if anyone wants to purchase a book, it goes towards the San Francisco Historical Society, and it's over here on the right. We hope to see you next month.
I can even autograph it if you.
Oh, Jim, where Lord and Ready will be doing managed San Francisco. Lots of interest. Thank you, Jim.